Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. It's been a long offseason, but unless I'm mistaken, there were some at least kind of games last week that now that the preseason of the NFL has started. So we figured it was about time to get this thing back up and running. I'm your host, Scott Spratt. I work for Sports Info Solutions, and I'm joined, as always, by Schatz of Football Outsiders. Before I let Aaron talk, I just want to point out to everybody listening to this that if you haven't already picked up your copy of the Football Outsiders Almanac, go ahead and do that. It came out about a week ago. I've been pouring through it, and this is just the best thing that happens during the football offseason. And so if you're a serious fan that's into analytics, you really need to pick it up and read it. Aaron, and I'm glad to hear that you've survived that ordeal and that you're out on the other side of it. How's it going?
It's good. I made it through the tough part. And I should, of course, also point out that the Almanac is filled with all kinds of stats from the Sports Info Solutions game charting. So
it's a happy marriage.
Happily work together on more than just this podcast. But I made it through all the late nights and the crazy editing and rewrites and stuff happening in July while we were finishing. And hopefully everybody enjoys the book this year and buys fantasy projections and wins their fantasy league and is ready for actual football to start in 3 weeks. Although I'll make do with preseason for now.
Sure. And I mean, that all sounds great, Aaron. I'm glad you're doing well. And now that you are, I'm going to just argue about how everything you said in there is wrong. So I think it'll make for a good podcast.
Oh, I don't think you can argue that everything I said in there is wrong. For example, San Francisco. Probably not going to argue with that.
No. I think you're right. It's probably more like 95% is correct, but that 5% is what we're going to be talking about today, I think.
Right. So today's show is going to be covering our NFC projections, and then we'll do another show in a couple of weeks for folks that will cover our AFC projections. Exactly.
And then when the actual NFL season starts, we'll be back to our just weekly podcast, and we'll give you updates on the schedule for all of that when we are closer to the season. But let's get started today with the NFC podcast. And the real order of things that I'm focusing on here is based on the projected win totals for every team, which you can find basically at the start, just before all the team sections, around page like 45 of the Almanac. And in the NFC, before I even opened the Almanac, I would have predicted that the Seahawks, Packers, and Panthers, in some order, would have been atop the NFC projections. When I actually looked at the projections, it was close, but not quite what I thought. The Seahawks lead the NFC with 10.5 expected wins. The Cardinals are second with 10.4, so that was a bit of a surprise. The Packers were third, 10.0, but then you had a jump down before the next team, and that was the Cowboys at 8.8, and the Panthers were next at 8.6. So again, I'm a biased Panthers fan, Aaron, so I'm going to be upset about this. What can you tell me about the reasons why the Panthers are projected so low, especially following their 15-1 season?
Well, the first thing I should point out for people who perhaps are new to what we do and are not used to our projections each year is the projection system plays out the season a million times and uses a range of possibilities for how good each team will be and then a range of possibilities for whether they win or lose, because sometimes an average team will end the season with a winning record because the ball just bounced their way a couple of times.
Sure.
So as a result, a simulation system like this naturally groups towards 8-8, much closer than the actual results are going to be, because while in the simulations we have enough seasons where teams go 12-4 and 13-3, when you average those out with seasons where teams go 7-9 or 6-10, even the best teams will come out with an average that doesn't seem realistic, because we're all thinking to ourselves, oh, the Seahawks will go 12-4, but we're not thinking to ourselves, well, what if everything goes wrong? And there is a possibility of everything going wrong.
Mm-hmm. I totally get that. Yeah,
because the best team is at 10.5 does not mean that we really think no team is going to win 11 games this year. Of course, a couple teams are going to win 11 games, and of course, a couple teams are going to only win 3 or 4.
That makes total sense. The major question is why the Panthers are then 2 wins short of the elite teams in the NFC.
Right. So the main reason behind that is, well, it's twofold. The first is that, if you remember from our discussions last year, the Panthers were not one of the top teams in the league over the course of the entire season based on our DVOA ratings. They were 6th or 7th, something like that. And, of course, they were much better in the second half of the year and great in the playoffs, but there's really no indication, looking back at history, that teams that end the season hot roll that over to the next year. So we start by projecting them based on where they were last year, roughly 6th or 7th. And then we expect the defense to really return to earth. It's not about the offense. And of course, the offense should be better because they're getting Kelvin Benjamin back. But for the defense, first of all, the turnover differential is insane.
Yeah.
And so one of the big parts of the defensive projection system is the idea that turnovers per drive will regress towards the mean, and that will cause a decline. Another big part of the system is what we consider lost approximate value over replacement on defense. So the net of players leaving versus players arriving over a certain level, and we use the Pro Football Reference approximate value. And using that number, Carolina has one of the 10 largest net losses of any team in the last dozen years. And for the most part, teams that lose a huge amount of talent on one side of the ball will decline, and teams that gain a huge amount of talent will improve. This is one of the things that caused us last year to predict that the Jets were going to improve significantly, and in fact, they did.
That did happen.
San Francisco last year was on the list of teams losing the most value, and of course, their defense did not play as well, and the whole team collapsed. So with Carolina, now the thing is that the loss of talent is mostly one guy.
Yeah, it's Josh Norman.
So, okay, are we overestimating the value of that guy? I don't know, but I think given that they're going to replace him with rookies, I don't know if we're really overestimating that value, because rookie cornerbacks, even the most talented ones, tend to struggle when they arrive in the NFL. To depend on two rookie cornerbacks as your starters, that is a tough go, no matter how good your front seven is.
Yeah, I completely agree with that point. I found the whole Norman rescinding of the franchise tag thing very confusing. And I really don't have any doubts that he's one of the best corners in the league. It was really amazing to watch him last year. But yeah, for me, it is the question of whether the front seven can overcome it, specifically K'Wan Short, defensive tackle, who does a really good job of disrupting in the middle, which kind of makes up for the fact that a lot of the edge rushers are good but not great to generate a lot of pressure. So I don't know. We'll see. 2 years ago when the Panthers were pretty good, they didn't have – I mean, they had Norman, I think, as a young player who wasn't really an impact player yet, but they were still very good defensively. So I don't know. It's weird. I guess there's not a lot of teams quite constructed in this way, but –
Oh, no, the Panthers are constructed in a fairly unique way. And I will say one of the reasons to believe that we might be wrong a little bit is that Norman is kind of a one-year wonder. I don't think he had ever been thought of as one of the top cornerbacks in football until last year. Yeah. So it's possible that this was just a one-year thing where he played out of his mind. Listen, they build their offense where they care more about their interior linemen than the tackles, and they build their defense where they're like, we can throw any cornerback we want onto this roster because our front seven is so good. So I don't know of a lot of other teams that build themselves that way. I mean, yeah, some teams concentrate on the front seven, but the Panthers really have put like undrafted free agents and guys just picked up off the scrap heap, and it wasn't until this year that they really used top draft picks on cornerbacks.
Yeah, it was strange. Let me jump back to the turnover differential point that you made earlier. And in last year, the Panthers had 20 more takeaways than they had giveaways, which is, you're right, it's insane. But one thing that I found interesting was that the Panthers actually have a positive turnover differential for each of the last 5 seasons. And I thought that perhaps because of the weird roster construction, that might be something that's at least to a certain extent sustainable. And the key pieces to that are, I would say, the speed at linebacker. They already had Kuechly and Thomas Davis, and I feel like Shaq Thompson might make an impact more this year. Another guy that is a real speedster. Actually, at one point was drafted to play baseball. Is just a really good athlete. Then on offense, basically they have one of the few run-focused offenses that relies on really big guys to carry the ball. Guys like Cam Newton, Jonathan Stewart, and Mike Tolbert, who tend not to fumble as much. Do any of those pieces kind of come into your mind to make you think that maybe the Panthers could sustain a high turnover differential, or is this something that pretty much regresses for everybody all the time?
It tends to regress for pretty much everybody all the time, but I think it is a reason. See, the thing is that the projection system projects offense and defense separately. Mm-hmm. So we're only considering here the turnover differential for the defense rather than the offense. I think that the idea that their offense is low in turnovers is a reasonable idea. They were in the top 10 lowest turnovers per drive in both 2012 and 2013. And I'll tell you, you have a reasonable argument as far as defense as well, because they were in the top 10 most turnovers caused per drive in 2014 and 2013. Mm-hmm. So they have been consistent in causing turnovers. It hasn't regressed to the mean that much. So you may be right that perhaps the system is overanalyzing this, but in general, teams do regress to the mean. It's also possible that the lack of regression towards the mean is the fluke.
Sure.
And that a more regression towards the mean is more realistic, or even that they'll regress towards the mean but not to it. That instead of being the best team in the league in takeaways, they'll be 9th or 8th. And that would still be a step down, although their defense would still be pretty good. And I think their defense will be pretty good. And of course, the other thing that I will point out is that we still have them winning their division fairly handily if every team plays to the average of our projections. They are still clearly have a much better chance of being a very good team than the 3 teams that they compete against in their division.
Yeah, and the fact that you don't have the Falcons ahead of the Panthers again this season, that pretty much calms me down a little bit. So I think I can deal with that. I could talk about the Panthers all day, Aaron, but unless you have another thing you want to talk about there, let's jump over to some other NFC teams, okay?
I'm not particularly interested in the rest of the NFC South. Unfortunately, I don't think most of fans are particularly interested in the rest of the NFC South, although they are kind of starting to build something nice in Tampa Bay. We'll see where that is in a year or two. Of course, New Orleans matters when your fantasy players are playing them because you want to get them all into the lineup.
Yeah, number 1 offensive DVOA, number 32 defensive DVOA last year, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, that's a lot of fantasy points.
In fantasy points, yeah. They were like 5th or 6th in offensive DVOA and had the worst defense of all time.
Pretty good. Well, actually, we're going to get back to Tampa in a minute, but the next 2 teams that I want to talk about are the Cowboys and the Vikings, because I think they might surprise some people for being sort of in that tier there with the Panthers. The Cowboys have 8.8 projected wins, and the Vikings have 8.6. And there's actually a pretty big gap after those guys to the rest of the NFC. The Lions are next at 8.1. And the rest of the division or of the conference is projected to go under 8 wins. So let's talk about the Cowboys and Vikings, and let's start with their quarterbacks, because I think both of them are sort of the big stories for the teams. Tony Romo, he missed most of last year because of an injury. So did Des Bryant. I was curious how your projections handle Romo's health. I'm not even sure there should be any sort of injury adjustments. He played at least 15 games the previous 4 seasons, but he's now had this collarbone injury twice, and he's 36 years old. So I was just curious how the system handles that.
And back problems.
Yes.
So in the Kubiak fantasy projections for players, that's a big reason why Romo is a red risk, because of his age and because of the injury issues, the missing last year, and the back problem.
Yeah.
As far as the team projections, that's not accounted for in the quarterback variable that gets thrown into the team projection any more than it would be for any other quarterback. So, it likes getting Romo back. Here's the remarkable thing about the Cowboys is that going back to 1990, we looked for teams that brought back their starting quarterback and their number 1 receiver, but then only got those players for fewer than 10 games each because of injuries. And there are only 9 teams like that in the last 26 years.
That's crazy.
And 2 of them were last year. And one is Baltimore. We'll get to them in a couple of weeks when we talk about the AFC. And the other is Dallas. It is really rare to lose 2 players like you did with Romo and Bryant, and I don't think anybody doubts that Des Bryant was not himself last year because he was playing injured when he was actually in the lineup.
That's 100% the case.
The other thing I should say is Dallas's defense is going to have the opposite of the effect Carolina's going to have. Dallas was the worst team in the league last year when it came to takeaways per drive, and that's likely to regress towards the mean. And usually teams like that will improve in defense the next year, like, for example, what happened to the Jets and the Chiefs between 2014 and 2015. The reason to question that is the same reason to question about Carolina. With Carolina, it's this defense is so fast, they've got a great pass rush, the front seven is so good. With Dallas, it's you question that because the defense isn't that fast, the front seven isn't so good, and the best pass rusher is gone because he's a jerk, and the second best pass rusher is suspended for 4 games, and the middle linebacker is suspended for 10 games, and so that makes you wonder how the defense can't really be good. But I think all Dallas needs is for the defense to be almost average, and their offense should carry them to the division title.
Yeah, at the very least, they'll be interesting. So that's a fun thing. So obviously the Cowboys are gaining back basically a really good quarterback, a really, really good wide receiver, and potentially they're gaining a really good running back in rookie Ezekiel Elliott. I wanted to get your thoughts on this, Aaron, because I think the sort of analytical idea that most analysts would share, and most like sabermetric-y types like us, is that teams probably shouldn't spend a high draft pick on a running back because there tends to be a little bit more uncertainty about how those guys produce in the league. Do you think that the Cowboys made a mistake drafting Elliott that high? And do you think that he will actually make a really big impact after last year they pretty much didn't have as much running back production as the previous year with DeMarco Murray?
I think they absolutely drafted him too high. That doesn't mean it's not an upgrade. That doesn't mean it won't help. It will help. He's an upgrade at running back, absolutely. But to draft a running back 4th, given the way talent works in the NFL these days, and given how pass friendly the league is, and how important passing and pass defense is, to draft a running back 4th just seems nuts. The only reason to draft a running back in the first round is if he's also a really good receiver, because the best running backs usually are the ones these days who also have a lot of receiving value, like a Jamal Charles or Le'Veon Bell. And yes, you might get an Adrian Peterson or a Todd Gurley who changed the game a little bit based on their running. But if you look at the guys drafted in the first round over the last few years, your odds that they'll be as good as their scouting reports are not as good as the odds that they'll fall short of their scouting reports, like, for example, the other running back taken last year, Melvin Gordon. So it's just a risk. There's a risk that Elliott is not the guy that we think he is. If Elliott is the guy they think he is, then I still think they took him too early, but taking him in the second half of the first round would make sense. The problem is that running backs are a risk in the first round. You don't know you're getting the guy you think you're getting. They're worth the pick if there's no risk, but that's not the world we live in.
Yeah, 2 bits of good news for them, even apart from the fact that Elliott might actually be a really good player, and we just don't really know that yet. One, the Cowboys' offensive line ranked 6th in DVOA last year, even though they pretty much had kind of a mess at running back itself.
Sorry, just to correct you, in adjusted line yards, I believe.
Right. Sorry, my mistake. So basically this line is set up for success. Even if Elliott isn't a transcendent player the way they're hoping for, they could still have an extremely good run offense. So I think that's a major positive point. And 2, just any kind of run game can really help them sort of take the pressure off of Tony Romo in case there are health concerns there, maybe get the ball out of his hands a little bit more, and let this offense carry the team. I think it's a possibility.
And that's why people are wondering why we have him in the fantasy projections so much lower than the average draft position otherwise, is because I think, when you read the tea leaves coming out of Dallas, and there's some tea leaf reading in this, it's not just stat projection. They want to run an offense like 2 years ago, and 2 years ago Romo only threw 435 passes, and so he's probably not going to throw, he's not going to throw over 500 passes. And that just gives him lower numbers than other quarterbacks because other guys are throwing the ball 600, 620 times.
Exactly. Okay, I got a little off track there, but let's circle back to the other team we were talking about, the Vikings, and their quarterback situation. Because Teddy Bridgewater, his counting stats were not that impressive last year. Just 3,200 yards passing with 14 touchdowns and 9 interceptions. For fantasy players like me, that looks pretty paltry. But I'm guessing that some of the advanced stats like DYAR think a little bit more highly of Bridgewater. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, the thing about Bridgewater's numbers, first of all, is the thing we were just talking about with Romo, there's a how much does he throw the ball thing going on. So he doesn't have the same number of He doesn't have the same number of attempts as other quarterbacks, and so he does do better in rate stats. Now, he was 21st in DYAR, which is a total. He was only 22nd in DVOA, but some of that has to do with the kind of throws that he throws. It's interesting. ESPN's QBR, which does not account for opponent strength, but does give quarterbacks more credit for deep throws, had Bridgewater 13th.
Okay, interesting.
Part of that was sort of quote-unquote clutch performance, and part of that was that he threw deep a lot rather than depending on yards after the catch from his receivers. And except he threw deep less than he could because his offensive line was horrible. And this is where we go below just our grand stat for DVOA for the player, which the DVOA doesn't filter out the effects of teammates and the effects of scheme. And if you look at the plays, the offensive line, Bridgewater was under pressure more than I think any other quarterback. I don't remember if it's in the league. Yeah, he was under pressure on 36% of pass plays. So that was the worst pressure rate allowed by any offensive line in the league. And he was just constantly running for his life. And the receivers weren't that great either. I mean, his breakout receiver was Diggs, who was a fifth-round pick, whose numbers faded as the year went on. Charles Johnson was supposed to be a big deal and kind of disappeared. So, he's a better quarterback than the people around him would lead him to look like. The question is it going to get better around him this year? The offensive line last year had two guys who were out for the whole year. And so they should improve by adding the free agent. So they added Alex Boone to play left guard. They added Andre Smith to play right tackle. And they get John Sullivan back at center from injury. But the receivers don't really seem that much better. Playmaker score, which is our wide receiver projection system, is not that high on Laquan Treadwell. And apparently the Vikings have not been that high on him in camp either, because he seems to have fallen out of the prospective starting lineup.
I mean, that seems kind of strange, considering they must have pretty recently scouted him and drafted him so highly.
And considering that Charles Johnson fell off the face of the earth last year, and now suddenly he's back to being the starter, what do you know about him now that you didn't know a year ago? It seems odd.
So it's weird, but I mean, if the offensive line is dramatically improved, that's going to make Bridgewater's life so much easier, regardless of how good the wide receiving talent is around them. So I think there's definite reason to expect the offense to improve in Minnesota. Weirdly, though, the defense might actually be the question now. When we were talking preseason last year, I think both of us were pretty high on the Vikings defense, which had a lot of youth and had some really exciting young blue-chip players like Anthony Barr. Circling back to what sort of happened for real last year, did their defense live up to our expectation of them sort of breaking out?
Yes and no. See, that's the interesting thing, is that this is where we were very different from conventional stats. The Vikings finished 5th in the league in points allowed, but in DVOA, they were only 14th. And there were a number of reasons for that. They faced fewer drives than most teams. Because of the quality of their special teams, the defense played against offenses that had worse starting position than most offenses tended to have. There were a number of things where when they came to actually moving the ball, even conventional stats showed that they were not as good as their reputation. They were only 13th in total yards allowed, 14th in yards per play, 20th in yards per drive. They were really good in the red zone, but that kind of bend but don't break philosophy doesn't tend to carry over from year to year. Usually red zone performance tends to regress towards what your overall defensive performance is. That being said, there clearly is a lot of good young talent here. You can imagine them improving, certainly. I think they will improve a little bit, maybe to match what their actual reputation is. And the other thing I'll say about the Vikings is that their numbers last year are heavily, heavily affected by 2 games where they were so much worse than they were the rest of the year. One was a game against Seattle where they were missing like half their starting defense. The other was that crazy, weird Week 1 game where they went to San Francisco in the Monday night late opening slot and got clobbered.
That was so weird.
A game that was later horrific for the whole year. We'll be bringing that one up whenever there's a surprising Week 1 result from now until the end of time.
God, I remember talking to you about that after it happened, and we're like, what? Were we just completely wrong about both of these teams? And I guess we weren't. It was just a really weird game. Okay. That was good.
The other thing I'll say about Minnesota quickly, this goes for the entire NFC North, and it's one of the reasons why Detroit is the next team in the projections after them. And that is the entire NFC North gets the AFC South this year and the NFC East, which were the two weakest divisions in the league last year. So the entire NFC North is looking kind of good for this season.
Okay, interesting. Well, that may inform our next topic, because the next thing I wanted to ask you somewhat relates to an article that you just put out on ESPN.com, where you were looking at which teams had the best chance of going from worst in their division to first this year. And the Cowboys, I think, were the head of that list. But to reframe it slightly differently for this conversation, since we're focused on the NFC, I wanted to ask you whether there were any teams below the Vikings in projected wins. So basically, of the guys that are projected to win 8 games or even fewer, is there any that stand out to you as a potential dark horse to maybe make the playoffs this year, or to even go on a run beyond that?
I would name 2 teams. One would be Washington. They're not a dark horse. They're not a dark horse for everybody, but we have them projected to completely fall apart.
Right.
If Kirk Cousins really is that guy from the second half of last year, and could even take a step forward past that, then Washington can compete again. I don't think it's going to happen. The other one is the Giants.
Okay, that's who I was thinking.
Yeah, because, first of all, injury totals tend to regress towards the mean, but they don't always. There are certainly certain teams that have a record of having more injuries every year, and other teams like Tennessee that have a record of having fewer injuries than usual every year. And the Giants are insane, having led the league in adjusted games lost to injury for 3 straight seasons. And if they could improve the health around there, and I'm not quite sure what you need to do to make that happen, that would be a big contributor to a step forward. And of course, you also have to like the talent that they added. They went out and spent a lot of money in free agency, and normally that doesn't turn a team around completely, but it helps, and their defense should be better than last year. And the reason why we have them projected to go roughly 8-8 is not because we think their defense is going to be really bad again. It's because we don't see their offense taking a big step forward. We do see their defense improving from bad to average. So if the defense improves even more than that, and if the offensive line can somehow get it together, if Eric Flowers, the left tackle, is much better than Kean Fahey gives him credit for, and Kean thinks he's horrible. If Sterling Shepard really is awesome like people think he's going to be, and if Victor Cruz is actually healthy from my mouth to God's ear, then the Giants are definitely competitors.
Yeah, the thing that stands out to me about them is that the potential is there for the defensive line to be really good again. Maybe not vintage Giants, but Olivier Vernon last year, he finished 4th in the league with 53 total pressures. He's coming in from Miami. And, I don't think anyone really talked about it, but Jason Pierre-Paul, he was top 5 in pressures last year over the final 5 weeks. He didn't actually get any sacks, but to me he looked pretty darn good. So I'm wondering if potentially they could make an impact there.
Yeah, that's absolutely a thing, is guys with lots of hurries but not sacks will tend to get more sacks the next year, and Pierre-Paul was insane. We have him through the SIS charting with 32 hurries and only 1 sack.
That's weird.
That's kind of nuts, and there's no way that repeats.
Yeah, I think so too. I thought you were going to talk about the Buccaneers here, and just independent of the fact that the Panthers are, I guess, the elite team from last year that looks like they may be worse this year in DVOA, I thought you might have some things to say about Jameis Winston and potentially stepping forward. Do you have any thoughts about their chances?
I just feel like the Bucs are too caught between being a young team on the rise and an old team on the decline.
I mean, that certainly stands out on their defense.
Yeah, it actually stands out, I think, on both sides of the ball, because on offense you have Logan Mankins retiring and then Vincent Jackson getting older, and the offense depends on him a lot to be across from Mike Evans. On defense, I mean, Brent Grimes has not been good the last couple years. Darryl Smith has been, but he is pretty old.
Yeah.
Robert Ayers is supposed to be their hot new pass rusher. He's 31 this year. So the thing is, Winston played better than our projections thought he would last year, and I think that we clearly underestimated him, and there should be another step forward like there usually is for a young, talented quarterback in his second season. And I like Mike Evans, and there is young talent on the offensive line, and it should improve over time, but I just cannot buy that defense. I just do not expect the defense to be good or even average. And I think that it will mean they're not going to make it up to where Carolina is.
Yeah. Okay, Aaron. Well, I think that wraps it up for our NFC preview. If you guys want to have a lot more depth than that, I suggest checking out the Football Outsiders Almanac if you haven't already. Meanwhile, look out for another episode from us probably 2 weeks from today where we'll cover the AFC, and there may be even a little bit more coming preseason before the year starts. So, Aaron, thanks again. Thanks for the Almanac, and thanks for joining me today. And I'll look forward to talking to you in a couple of weeks, okay?
Sounds good. Hope everybody enjoys a couple of weeks of preseason. And remember the mantra, oh, my God, please let nobody get hurt.
Exactly.